Hi. In this video, we're going to pick up our discussion of macromolecules and talk about proteins and nucleic acids. We'll start with protein, but before we get into the nitty-gritty of protein, I want to remind you that protein is a macromolecule. Macromolecules are very large molecules. In this case, protein is also a polymer, which is a molecule made up of a smaller repeating unit. That repeating unit is called a monomer, and for protein, the monomer's name is an amino acid. So this diagram here represents the basic structure of an amino acid. The R is what we call a side chain. In biology, there's 20 different amino acids that we're going to be concerned about, and those 20 different amino acids differ by what this side chain is. It could be a carbon with 3 hydrogens on it. It could be a whole bunch of carbons and hydrogens on it. There's a variety of things that it could be. So we just represent that with R. But the basic amino acid structure we see represented on this top portion. So we've got a central carbon that has just a hydrogen and our R group on it. And then on one side we have an amino group, and then on the other side we have a carboxylic acid group. These then join together by dehydration synthesis to make a big long chain of amino acids. So when we talk about the elements common in proteins, we see that we have, of course, carbon, of course, hydrogen, some oxygen, and nitrogen. Some of our R groups just have those. Others have a couple other things. There's occasionally some sulfur. So for our common elements, we're looking at carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur. The monomer, as I mentioned, is an amino acid, and it's worthwhile drawing this diagram, or the one on the previous page, because it is fairly important that you understand the structure of an amino acid. Remember, it's a central carbon atom with hydrogen on one bond, an amino group on the other bond, a carboxylic acid group on another, and an R chain, or in other words, a group of 20 different possibilities. Let's pause for a second and let you jot that down and review. So, unlike carbohydrates, where all we need to know is the monomer are joined together by dehydration synthesis, protein structure is a little bit more complicated than that. Proteins have 4 levels of organization. The most basic level is just like carbohydrates, where it's monomers attached to each other. So we call that first level a polypeptide, or in other words, the chain of amino acids. The bond that joins them when dehydration synthesis happens is between the amino group and the carboxylic acid, and we call that a peptide bond, which is why it's called polypeptide. And that bond is right here. So the first level of organization in protein is the amino acids. That's actually what our DNA codes for. It's a really, really, really important level that determines all the rest. That order of amino acids then determines how the protein, that big long chain of amino acids, folds up. Sometimes it folds in kind of accordion style, and other times it twists. They have special names. You don't need to know it. The third level is how the folds are held together. And finally, the fourth level is that sometimes different protein structures are bonded together with other polypeptide chains that are folded and clumped to have one giant clump. And they look something like this. This huge quaternary structure was just these big globby molecules. I'll show you a picture of one. I'll show you an example of one in class. And that's what basically makes up most of our cells. And they're all determined by what the structure or what the order of the amino acids are. There's something really important that we need to note about protein, and that is that structure that we see here. This is what makes a protein work. If it has one different fold or one different clump in one way, or something twists or folds backwards the other way, it doesn't work. And so proteins are very sensitive. Those bonds that hold the clumps and the folds together are very delicate and very easily come apart. And so those bonds that hold those other levels together can be broken by heat, by motion, by something being too acidic. And if those bonds that hold them together break, we call it denaturation. And when the protein becomes denatured, the native state, or in other words, the shape that the protein is supposed to have, becomes unraveled. It would be kind of like if you pull the thread of a scarf and the whole thing turned into a pile of yarn. It doesn't function anymore as a scarf, it's just a pile of yarn. When a protein denatures, it comes apart and stops working. That's why homeostasis is so important. If we don't maintain our temperature and our pH and everything else, our proteins will literally fall apart. When we do our enzyme lab, you'll see just how important that denaturation is. We'll watch that video in class. Okay, so why are proteins important? Well, proteins are important because they do nearly everything else in our cells. So carbohydrates are some structure and energy. Lipids are mostly energy with some membranes and some chemical messengers and waterproofing. Proteins do like everything else except code. So proteins are basically any function in your body, they're controlled by proteins. Passing stuff in and out of the cell, controlling your enzymes, controlling your metabolism, reproduction, just about literally everything your cell does is done by a protein. So structure, movement, regulating your cell processes. We'll talk about enzymes next. They end in ACE, but that's neither here nor there now. They transport material in your blood, and they help fight disease in the form of antibodies. They are just wholly super important. Let's pause one more time and review proteins. The last category of the 4 macromolecules is called nucleic acid. Nucleic acid have a monomer too. Nucleic acids are made up of a repeating unit, and the monomer is called a nucleotide. The nucleotide has this structure to it. So there's a phosphate group. The phosphate has phosphorus with 4 oxygens and sometimes some hydrogens depending upon whether or not it's bonded to something else. Nucleotides also have a sugar group. In this case, the sugar is either deoxyribose or ribose, usually. And then finally, there is what we call a nitrogen-containing base. You learned about what acids and bases were in our last section. We're not going to worry about it now, but simply that they are a nitrogen-containing ring in it. Sometimes there's 2 rings, sometimes there's 1 ring, but this is our basic monomer building block of a nucleotide. You may recognize when I said the name of the sugar was deoxyribose. If we put it all together, deoxyribonucleic acid, often known by its monomer, its abbreviation DNA, is the most familiar of the nucleic acids. If we look for our common elements, we see, of course, that we have carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. We also have phosphorus and nitrogen, so we're looking at 5 common elements. Our monomer, as I mentioned, is a nucleotide, which has a sugar, a phosphate, and a nitrogen-containing base. And the structure is that the nucleotides join in a strand. So what happens is that phosphates join to sugars, which join to phosphates, which join to sugars, and the bases all stick off to the side. So it looks something like that. In the case of DNA, DNA is double-stranded, so there are 2 strands that go together. In the case of something called RNA, which is kind of DNA's shorter cousin, it's made of only 1 strand. As I mentioned, the most famous type of nucleic acid is DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a really long way of describing the type of carbohydrate that makes up the sugar in our nucleotide. So it's a nucleic acid, which means that it's a chain of nucleotides held together. In this case, the chains of nucleotide are 2 of them, and they are paired. And in the middle of the 2 strands, in the center, are 2 hydrogen bonds right here. And so there's a chain of nucleotides on one side, a chain of nucleotides on the other, and they twist around each other in what we call a double helix. We will have a much more extensive unit on DNA now, so we're not going to take the time to focus on it just yet. Of course, you probably know that DNA is in charge of coding for the information that makes us, us. But what you may not realize is the information that makes us, us is really just a recipe for proteins. Remember I mentioned how important proteins are in our functions? And so by being the recipe for proteins, DNA is the recipe for us. So DNA looks something like this, and it's a humongous molecule. And if we take a look, we have our phosphate, and here's our deoxyribose sugar, and this is a nitrogen-containing base. It's connected via hydrogen bonds to another nitrogen-containing base, which is attached to a sugar, which is attached to a phosphate. So again, at this point, what I want you to know is that it's chains of nucleotides. Here's one. Here's another. So chains of nucleotides twisted around each other in 2 long strands. RNA is also a nucleic acid, but it's much, much smaller. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. The ribose just means that that's the name of the sugar is ribose. And it's single-stranded as opposed to DNA, which is double-stranded. It's also much, much shorter. And we'll get into RNA in much more detail, but basically RNA is responsible for helping to assemble the protein. So DNA codes for the proteins, or is the recipe for proteins, and RNA is kind of like the chef that makes the proteins. DNA and RNA are our two main types of nucleic acids, and they work together very closely. They're involved in a process called protein synthesis, and once again, we'll get into this much more detail in a separate unit. This, though, is kind of what RNA looks like. It's a kind of an uneven, twisted strand that doesn't have a partner on the other side. DNA and RNA are the main types of nucleic acid, but there are some other ones. In class, we'll hear quite a bit about a molecule known as ATP. ATP is a single nucleotide, and it's just a little bit different. Instead of having a nitrogen-containing base, a sugar, and one phosphate, it actually has 3 phosphates. Its job is to help us, it's the energy molecule of the cell. We'll get into that when we talk more about the cell's metabolism. Let's take one last time to review. So that's it. We've got carbohydrates that are mostly for energy and structure, lipids that store energy, that help our membranes and that help us translate messages and things like that, help waterproof us, proteins that make up just about everything we do, and nucleotides which help us make and code for the proteins. That's it for proteins and nucleic acids. As always, make sure you come see me if you have any questions.